What makes a good drawing? This is not such a straightforward question for an artist who's trying to consistently improve their drawing skills. Because when we think about what makes a good drawing, it's easy to focus entirely on our skill development and to be impressed with them if they've progressed in a way that we think is more effective. But our skills, even great skills, don't make a good drawing, let alone a great one. Although unfortunately, if we draw with poor drawing skills, then it's really obvious and it's hard to go beyond seeing those poor skills to see the drawing at all. But if we draw with good drawing skills, then those drawing skills themselves shouldn't be particularly noticeable, or at least it shouldn't be the first thing that we notice, because we'll be too busy looking through the drawing skills at the overall drawing, not analysing its parts, not working out how this effect, how this subject, how this presentation was formed, how it came together. And this got me thinking, how much when we draw do we consider the overall appeal of a scene or a subject before we start to draw it? Because if I'm going to put my time into a drawing, then surely I want it to be able to be a good drawing should all the skills that I'm trying to use come together well. The parts, the composition, the focus, the story that the scene says. What is it that makes a good drawing a good drawing? And I think there's two things. I think one is what I call the visual drama of the scene. And this is starting to get a little more back into the technical side, but I think of this as many different elements that come together. And it's not so much the skill with which we draw these elements that I'm thinking of, but it's having scenes that actually contain these elements to be drawn in the first place. I'll come back to that in a second. The other way I think we can have a good chance of a good drawing is more to do with what we're looking at. So, is there a story, for instance? So in this scene here, really any subject with a pathway, with a stairway, with a doorway, there is an element of an invitation to come in, of a narrative that maybe is halfway through or is beginning or has just ended. But there is something which causes us to linger in a moment in this place and to become absorbed into it. And that can be, that sort of scene can, I think, very easily produce a good drawing in that it becomes an image that attracts people's attention, causes people to look for a longer period and to start to become involved in some creative way in their thinking as they look at it. But it doesn't have to be a story. It could be an image, an object that is presented in a way that certain qualities come out. So it could be the sheer size of a certain object, perhaps things that are around it to give a sense of scale, perhaps because of the way it overfills the space on the paper. But somehow the object is presented in a way that its size, its massiveness impresses. It could be an object or a place that's incredibly decorative, that's incredibly almost over-ornamented, perhaps like some of my Palais Garnier staircase scenes, where it's the overwhelming detail which creates the oomph, that creates the drawing in. And of course that's a great subject because it also involves the staircase, and it also involves the implied narrative of a night at the opera and of walking up those stairs and going into the auditorium area. So there different stories that we can present in our scene. So that's the first question we need to ask ourselves. Am I drawing something which is in itself going to be engaging, interesting, challenging to look at? But then beyond that, we can present the scene in a certain way that visually it has tension and drama that snaps attention, that draws the eye, that creates interest. I find the most helpful way of thinking of crafting visual drama into my drawings is to think of contrasts, to have contrasts that play off each other in different ways. And so in this drawing here, let me just explain as you continue to watch me draw it, some of the contrasts that we have. So we have contrast of scale. We have some things that are larger and closer and those same things further away. And the most obvious thing are the leaves. But we also have the grass in the very foreground, and compared to the grass it's a bit further back. But we have the leaves in the upper left-hand section compared with the leaves right further back. We have trees that are closer and trees that are further back, both large trees closer and further back, and small trees even closer and further back. And so we're able to play off this tension between larger and smaller. And these also partly come because we've got a scene that has a great depth of plane. So I've made sure in my drawing that I make a focus on the grass in the very front, because anything that attracts the eye really, really close to where the viewer is standing brings the depth forward, and then it goes back further to whatever the furthest point, in this case, these further trees. If that grass were to be covered, that grass in the lower left, suddenly the scene does not feel nearly as deep as it does with that grass there. And while we don't want it to be the main focus, we do want it to pull the eye down into that corner so that then when we look up at the scene, we have further back to go. Now, there's a contrast of surfaces in this scene. So we've got this smooth rock in the foreground contrasted with the texture, the visual texture of the grass and of the leaf litter that we have scattered on it, and also in front to the right hand side and behind it. So contrasts on surfaces that also help the eye make sense. It gives space for our brain to rest and to work out exactly what's happening, exactly what we're looking at. Now we have a contrast here of a natural bush scene, but with the man-made steps as well. And so we have all of these lines that basically aren't straight. Even the tree trunk sides aren't properly straight. But then in contrast with that, we have these horizontal lines stepped back of the timber supports for each of the steps. And visually, that creates a contrast, and contrast again attract the eye, and it'll also help the brain to sort out what's happening. Now we can arrange detail also to create framing. And in this scene, we have framing around the far scene. The space at the top of the stairs, but further back, where we have more white paper really almost than anywhere else. Now, that white, surrounded by just the darkness of lines, also attracts attention and draws us in. But it does create a tension, and we have a framing of that space with these two large trees on each side. And another important element of creating visual drama, visual interest, is to have lines at angles to each other. Lines that run into each other at angles. So this major tree, the one that's on the left-hand side, creates a V shape. And then a bit to the other side, we have another tree now leaning in the opposite direction that is more like a trident shape, actually has 3 divisions. And these angles, these V-shaped, W-shaped angles that are formed by the trunks and branches, creates this visual tension. We also see the same effect in the closer but very thin trunks to the left-hand side in front of those background trees, where they branch out not as severely, but they lean away from each other. And then behind that tree, we have another darker tree that crosses the trunk of the main tree. In fact, I should have increased the angle of that crossing. I should have lowered the angle down a bit towards the ground. That would have increased the visual tension in the scene if I'd done that. But sometimes it's not as obvious as these trees are. If we look at the foreground, we can see there's a line that at the bottom of the steps that slopes down from the right to the left, where we have a lot of white space. But if we look on the left-hand side just above that, we have another line coming down that meets it just under that bottom step. But that plane is really defined by greater hatching, by a darker value. And that creates a line of darkness that comes in and meets at an angle the line of the lighter shade. And there are other lines in this scene that do a similar thing a similar way. Another way to create visual drama is to have contrasts of value, of light and dark. Again, because that helps the eye shift from object to object, and that's particularly helpful or vital in a scene such as this, where there are a lot of lines being used to convey the sense of the overwhelming complexity, the detail, the huge amount of leaf, of dirt, of blade of grass, of rocks, of pebbles, of everything, where that enormous number is part of what we're seeing, part of what the interest is. This is not parkland. This is natural bush. And so we want to have all these marks that reflect that. But the challenge is that we don't get lost in the marks, and having clear areas of dark and light, maintaining some paper, but creating deeper hatching than others is a great way to do that. Another thing that helps our scenes have a sense of visual drama is to not let things get centered, not to let the main focal point be dead center, but to create points of attention that are slightly off center, one way or another, to the left, to the right, up or down. And exactly what creates the center point depends on what the scene is and depends on how it's drawn. But in this drawing, I think the focal center point is that dark space just to the left of the start of the stairs, and then it's the tree branching up to the left. And so that keeps the immediate attention to the left-hand side. And once we've gone there and gone there, now our eyes can start to follow some of the other angles and some of the other details as our brain starts to work out, what am I looking at? What am I seeing? It's very easy to get focused on, as an artist, that a good drawing is a scene, an object that is drawn technically well. But I really would maintain that in a good drawing, we don't notice the skill level of drawing it straight off. What we see is the overall effect of something that's interesting to look at, something that's impressive to look at, perhaps something that's frightening to look at, but something that impacts us in some way that provokes a response within us. Whether to repel us away from it or to draw us into it doesn't really matter. that in some way it engages with us because of what we're seeing. And my skill with a pen or a pencil or watercolor shouldn't be the first thing that's noticed, because then I've become distracted from the purpose of the drawing, of what the artist is wanting to show, of why the artist wanted to draw it in the first place. And I think what this says to me is we should, as artists, be somewhat fussy about what we draw. Be somewhat choosy, not just to draw anything, but to draw things where there is something in that subject, in that reference or that scene in front of us that really grabs our attention, that is something we can feel some passion or reaction to, which we then try and capture in our line work, in whatever skills we need to use. It's not about making a copy of what we're seeing, of what we're looking at. It's about going beyond that and creating a statement in some way, positive or negative. And I think, as with all the skills that we use when we start to draw, we might as well start developing this skill of choosing subjects that have interest, that have impact, that have a purpose. Because that overriding purpose for our drawing, of what we want it to do or to show or result in, will help guide our technique beyond mere copying to creating an impact, to capturing an effect, and quite possibly even exaggerating an effect, because that's what we can do when we draw. We're not limited by our reference. We can go beyond it and draw something even more impressive than our reference. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this interesting. I think it's a really helpful point to think about sooner rather than later when we draw. But look, whatever you draw and however you draw it, and for whatever purpose you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.